my crime scene of a body picked apart and handed over. And she took my hand from the side of the bed and looked me in the eyes. And she said, "You are braver and stronger than you know." And I have carried that with me ever since. And I would offer you the exact same words. You are braver and stronger than you know.
Hello, and welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. This is the best place to find inspiring stories of women and girls across the country who will inspire you, challenge you, and empower you to be the person you were created to be and to change the world through your life. It's your girl Kate here, and I am excited to be back here for another week with another inspiring story for you. Please make sure that you're subscribed to the One Girl Revolution podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We are at One Girl Revo. That's the number One Girl REVO on all of those platforms. And please share our content with all of your family, friends, and followers. I always say on this podcast that the free and easy way to support any person or organization is to share their work. And so I encourage you to please share everything that we're doing with One Girl Revolution, share our podcast, our documentaries, and our social media. We are so grateful for all of your love and support, so please continue to support this mission. You can find out more information about One Girl Revolution, find all of our podcast episodes, watch our Emmy-nominated documentaries, donate to our nonprofit organization, and so much more on our website at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I can't believe I finally get to have Kimberly Corban, the Kimberly Corban, on the podcast. I've been following her story for years, and I love following her on social media and all the incredible work that she's doing. She has a podcast with our friend, Kara Robinson Chamberlain, who has been on the podcast before. Their podcast is called Survivor's Guide to True Crime. Kimberly herself is a survivor of sexual assault. So this is your warning. We talk about some really difficult issues in this podcast episode. Kimberly is a survivor and a victim. As she says in this podcast episode, it depends on the day, which I loved that perspective. Sometimes she is a victim, sometimes she is a survivor. But to me, she is a strong, amazing, brave survivor. She has become a vocal advocate and supporter of women and has dedicated her life to supporting survivors and elevating survivors' voices and their stories. You're going to be blown away by Kimberly's story, her passion, and her mission to bring justice, love, and support to the world. I love this woman and her story, and you will too. Here's my conversation with Kimberly. Kimberly, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I remember reading about your story forever ago, and I just have followed you on social media and followed everything that you're doing and all the great work that you do every single day. And finally, I feel like I'm having you on the podcast, but I don't believe in coincidences. So I believe that this is the moment that you were meant to be on this podcast. And we've had your friend Kara on. So we're going to talk about your podcast, the podcast that you're doing with her, but I want to have your story shared with our audience. And so I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast today.
Well, I'm really honored to be here. I love having these conversations, especially when it's with people who are so like-minded and wanting to, talk about things that truly matter, but with the people from different walks of life that are making them happen.
Yeah, well, you are raising up an army and giving women the space to share their stories. And just like you said, this podcast is all about that, about elevating women's voices and their stories and to allow women to tell their stories in the way that they want, which I think is rare in this world, especially in the media. But we really want to create this space for women's stories to be told. So grateful to have you on and so excited to share about the great work that you're doing. You are an advocate for sexual assault survivors, and you are one. So you're able to connect with survivors in a really unique way. But before we get into your survivor story and everything that you're doing now, I would love to rewind to your early life before you got into college. What can you tell me a little bit about your life and your story?
Sure. Well, before I really get started here, I do want to offer a quick content warning. If you have kiddos in the car or listening on a speaker, may not be an appropriate episode for them, or just kind of fast forward through this next part here. There are resources available. I'm sure we'll have them in show notes, and I've got them on my website too, but we are going to be discussing sexual assault and crime victimization. So I grew up in Greeley, Colorado. It's about an hour north of Denver. I was a very happy, outgoing kid. I've got one brother who's 2 years younger than me. I'm the classic oldest daughter. My parents are still together and still very flirty and in love with each other. So I lived really in a bubble growing up. People talk about childhood trauma all the time. I didn't have any of that. I really was loved and cared for and fostered this sense of confidence from an early age. I was in high school involved in every single sport you could imagine and club, and just stayed really active. And then I got to college, which was here in my hometown. I did move and have the whole dorm experience and everything else to make sure that I got the college experience, even though I was going to school in my hometown, and I loved it. I didn't go home and stay with my parents until Thanksgiving break. So I truly feel like even though I was at home, quote unquote, I still left home for this and had a completely different experience on the other side of town.
What were you studying in college? What were things that you were involved in?
I think I was a little lost. I didn't quite know who I was, but I knew that I had an interest in business marketing. This is so weird because I think everybody now feels like they are into video production and making videos and content. Well, that wasn't always the cool, trendy in kind of thing. And I would use my parents' Sony Handycam, and I have my own little high 8 tapes. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you might be a youth, but they're like those really old school, smaller tapes. And I would make videos. I'd do documentary style. I'd try to tell stories and things. And it's so funny and totally cringy for the record. Like I look back on them now, like, oh my God. But I would like tip the camera sideways and then we'd roll, and that was the Titanic sinking. And so like that kind of mindset. I loved doing that kind of stuff. And I think I just was drawn towards commercials and advertisements and that sort of thing. And UNC in town had a really great business college. So I was studying business marketing. I thought I would go into advertising. All will be right with the world. I'll make $1 million. Narrator, that didn't happen.
Life changes and things happen in our lives, and you never know what path, or sometimes you come to a crossroads where it's like, okay, do I do that? Do I continue on that path? But I'm a firm believer that sometimes things happen to us, or we have experiences that open our eyes to a new path, and that sometimes our stories are able to help other people. And that's really what you've been able to do through your story. So your story took a big turn, a really difficult turn. So you moved off campus, and then in May of 2006, your life changed. What can you share about that?
I went to bed on the evening of May 11th, a normal 20-year-old college kid that was going to school and working and had friends and not a care in the world. And when I awoke, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was being pushed back down into my pillow because I was laying in my bed on my stomach, and I just hear this low, taunting voice telling me to shut up. And I knew that something was very wrong from there. A man had broken into my apartment. He held me captive for over 2 hours and sexually assaulted me. And I had to lay there at 20 years old, believing that was how I was going to die. Every fiber of my being, my actual brain chemistry changed from that morning on. When I was able to survive that, I don't even want to call it an incident or a crime, but you can look back in your life and you have those moments where everything is before and after. Some people, it's this jilting where I found out my spouse cheated on me, or maybe you find out you're pregnant, or there's just so many different things that can happen in people's lives where you look at it in retrospect as before and after. That's that moment for me. I survived, called 911 immediately. I knew at the time that a black and white line had been crossed and that a crime was being committed. That alone is very different from most sexual assaults, any kind of harassment, or the things that we so often brush under the rug and say, it's just part of growing up as a girl. And so finding my voice in that moment when I am terrified, screaming for help, isn't something that people typically see, but it is something that crime victims feel. I was believed every single step of the way by dispatchers, by the police, by my forensic nurse examiner, then by detectives, by advocates, my parents, my friends, my boyfriend, all the way up into prosecution, which this ultimately led to. So they caught this guy 3 weeks to the day. He was picking out his next victim at an apartment complex about half a mile away from mine. He was held on $1 million bond. And then we went through the judicial process, which was completely foreign to me. But he was successfully prosecuted. And after a 5-day jury trial, the jury found him guilty of sexual assault and of burglary. You don't just have me going through this on my own. I am, quote, the primary victim. And I'm using air quotes here, because the primary crime happened to me. But I also want you to think about my roommates who were victims of burglary. Their home, their sanctum had been violated and their sense of safety had been compromised. My parents who walked in that morning to my apartment with a ton of officers and people they'd never seen, and seeing their daughter sitting in the fetal position on her couch, knowing that they can't touch her because my body's a walking crime scene. They experienced vicarious trauma. All of these people in this ripple effect, because of one person's actions, one person's crime, feel this trauma. And still to this day, it's a weight that we carry. So as I was leading up to this, having problems in school, just completely upended everything for me mentally, physically, emotionally. I started thinking, why did this have to happen to me? And not in a way that I'm pitying myself, but if I have to go through this, I'm going to make sure that it's with a purpose. And so I decided at the conclusion of trial that I would release my name to the media. If I could help just one person not have to experience what I did, then this would be worth it. I didn't realize the ripple effect that I was then creating by sharing my story and my voice and what had happened, because at that time, it was 2007 when we finally had the conclusion to the trial. I didn't have people to look to. There weren't social media platforms where survivors are sharing their stories. It wasn't in the media constantly about, whether it's a hashtag sort of movement, or if it's talks about consent, or really any kind of actual crime victim advocacy. That was not what permeated our media, our content, the things that we're consuming, the conversations that we're having on a day-to-day basis. And I wanted to be a point of light for other people, because I found out quickly, it isn't just me that this happens to, it is a lot of people. And they started by whispering to me. And now I have them shouting from the rooftops alongside me as well. And that's ultimately the greatest gift, if I were to leave this earth today, to be able to say, if I helped you find your voice, then I've done my job here.
It takes so much courage to use your voice, and so much courage, I'm sure, for you as a college student, as such a young person, to step out and share your story, but also to attach your name and this person, right? Sometimes we read about stories and it's not a real story to us because it's not connected to a person, or they don't use somebody's name. But here you are, a real person standing before the world, and what courage, but also what a gift to so many women, because when one woman steps forward and shares her story, we've had Rachel Denhollander, who's one of the survivors of Larry Nassar, on this podcast, and even what she was able to do, and had, it went from one person, her sharing her story, to hundreds of women stepping forward, and justice was served because of that, because women all across the country stood up.
Yes.
And that's what you're really creating too, what your story has opened up. And I know that that's also a weight that you carry, right? As a young person, to stand up, and then you start hearing these stories and trying to just navigate your own feelings and your own experience. And then
helping other people find their voice and work through their own experiences as well.
Well, and I think I was kind of naive when I did it at first, just that there's not a playbook for this. I'm not looking at, oh, this person spoke out and look at all the awful things that happened as a lot of people would today. So I think that probably helped me, at least in the beginning. And then when comment sections became a thing, it's like, ooh, there's a lot of work to do. Okay, let's get down to it here. I also am not blind to the fact that I was a 20-year-old white college middle-class female that had a stranger break into her apartment. Like, it is all of the headlines that a news producer could ever hope for. And it was because of that maybe I didn't feel the same shame or stigma or guilt that society so often places on the shoulders of the victims. Using that to be able to speak out so that hopefully people who are feeling that can say, oh, I felt the same way, or this sort of trauma response is validated. She felt the same way, even though it was XYZ. I have been called more times than I can count the, quote, perfect victim. There's no such thing as a perfect victim. And I love that just because I'm able to speak out about this one crime doesn't mean that it's any worse or any better than other people's trauma. When the Me Too movement really started taking off, I was asked by an outlet, aren't you mad about this? Aren't you mad that people are grouping themselves in with what happened to you? I said, absolutely not. No way. Because if you are speaking up about that sexual harassment within the workplace, if you are calling into question the jokes that are made around you, if you have been fondled, if it's an inner partner violence situation, all of these things are on a continuum of violence. People don't wake up one morning and just be like, I think I'm going to rape somebody today. It is all these little stair steps that they take to see what they can get away with, a little more and a little more. And eventually they work up to the stranger who breaks into the window. Or worse, the person who gains your trust, has a relationship, and then takes it too far, and then compromises whatever your boundaries or your consent. And so I didn't mind having all of these people. In fact, I wanted them all raising their voices, because at some point we are able to take everything that has happened, this entire lexicon of abuse that is gender-based violence, and say, enough is enough. No, it's not going overboard. No, it's not overcorrecting. It's correcting the record for this is how we grow up as women. This is how we are conditioned. This is how we have been living. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then great, we're doing our job.
It's unacceptable. And we all have opportunities, like you shared, to speak up. Maybe we aren't a survivor of sexual assault, but we might see something or know someone that's going through something, and to encourage and stand with people. And I know that you had that. You had people that stood with you and supported you when you shared your story. And even I know that you've talked about how numerous people have talked about how your story really is how the justice system should handle these types of things, because you were believed every single step of the way. And that's not a lot of women's experiences.
Exactly. When I share my story, I say that my story is statistically insignificant, in that out of roughly 100 sexual assaults, it's only 0.02 to 5-ish% where those offenders will spend a day in jail. And that is unacceptable. So that in itself, statistically insignificant, but also I was believed, which isn't always the response that we see and exactly what we want to change. Now, I work as a consultant within Violence Against Women International, who started the Start by Believing campaign. Fantastic. Please check it out. I'm sure we'll have links in here. I've got them all over my pages and everything. But the Start by Believing campaign acknowledges the fact that most victims are not going to just pick up the phone and call 911 as their first outcry like I did. It's that Tuesday night where you're feeling a little down and that friend decides to disclose to you, to say to you, I think what happened to me wasn't okay. And in that moment, your response can decide whether or not that victim has the opportunity to seek crisis services or to report or to transform themselves into whatever they want to be down the line. If that's a survivor, then great. But It's that response that matters. We have study after study that shows that those initial outcries, if they are negative, will shut a victim down. And then they don't access the services that they need. They don't report. And these offenders are not held accountable. Just like we say, everyone knows someone who has been a victim of sexual violence. I will also put it out to you that this is very uncomfortable, but you probably also know someone who has perpetrated sexual violence. It isn't the mugshot that you see next to my picture when we talk about this that's my assailant. It may be somebody that's in your photos on your Facebook album. It may be somebody that you see every day at your child's school. It could be someone that you think to yourself, well, they've never done anything to me. And your response in those moments matters. Because what we also know is that they are not creating just one victim in their lifetime. On average, an offender will create at least 6 victims themselves. And if we aren't able to step up and hold them accountable, we can do, at the very least, believe the survivors.
Donate to One Girl Revolution's nonprofit organization to help us continue our work, highlighting inspiring women and girls that are changing the world through their lives, promoting their work and their organizations, and building a powerful and positive force out in the world dedicated to empowering women, their voices, and their stories. Donate at onegirlrevolution.com/donate. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com/donate.
And you were believed every step of the way. And I think that's such a great example for everyone who is listening. I think that women have we should always trust our gut because we have such a gift in that. If there is somebody that makes you uncomfortable, I always believe that there's probably a reason, and to just pay attention to things that are going on. But I want to ask you about the response, because we talked a little bit about how you were believed all along the way. What was the response on campus? What was the response from your community, from people just in your own area, your local area?
Great question. So part of journalistic ethics is to not disclose the name or the identity of alleged victims while the case is ongoing or thereafter if it's their wishes. So I technically was anonymous. This is the hardest word for me, and I will never get it right. Anonymity. I always sound like Finding Nemo. Anonymity. Anonymity wasn't something that I was. It wasn't always what I needed so desperately, because from the time that I reported, they were looking down every lead possible. We figured this has got to be somebody who knows me or knows my roommate. It's somebody who's maybe connected on the French, because he knew a lot about me. He stayed in my apartment talking for another hour after he completed his assault, which I kept him talking in a way to gather information and evidence so that hopefully they could use that to find him after the fact. It did help, and it did actually feed into what they ultimately did with the prosecution on top of DNA, which, that's always going to be the nail in the coffin. But I think that the response on campus, even though I was anonymous in the media, I wasn't anonymous in this small college community. UNC has about 13,000 students at that point, and I was a part of Greek life. My very best friends I made in Alpha Phi, the sorority there. We had lived there for our sophomore year. I can't say enough good things about my experience with them. And because of that, everyone in the Greek community knew that this happened. Some of them were questioned, trying to give information. We're all talking, trying to figure out who this could have been. So it was a lot of active participation. And then once he was actually captured, it was oh my gosh, it's a college student, a 4.0 criminal justice major from the neighboring college, and people diving back through that. And so, the conversation would come up a lot sometimes to me, but it was a lot of people disclosing that maybe hadn't before. And because they knew that I was a survivor, they felt safe enough to do so, which was awesome. I was not a victim advocate at that point, and Lord knows I had plenty of unhealed trauma, and still I was able to hold space for them the same way that so many others now hold space for those people who are disclosing. So I think the response overarching response for me was extremely positive, but you still have, once it gets out a little farther outside of just the group that I know, how did this happen? You didn't meet him beforehand, and they start kind of questioning, it's human nature to question. And I think one of the big things to take away from this, when we talk about Start by Believing in this campaign, I go and speak on college campuses. It is my favorite thing to do because that is the population that I was part of when my life was turned upside down. I always thought that I would never be the person this could happen to until it did. And so when I go and talk to them, it's a conversation about, it's hard to believe that your fraternity member who you are dear friends with could have done this to someone else. It's hard to believe that the boyfriend of someone else could do this. Or sometimes it is female. It is a smaller population, but we do have female offenders as well. It's hard to wrap our heads around that because of cognitive dissonance. I should also point out I changed to psychology halfway through my junior year because, really important life decisions. And that was such a smart move on my point, but I was passionate about it. When I say this, though, it is because our minds don't want to think that we could be in the same position. We don't want to acknowledge the fact that in the back of our minds, we know that it could happen to us too. And so if we say, well, it wouldn't be this person because I know them, and I'm going to create in my mind a story about all the things that I'm going to question, that I'm going to say, if I were in the position of this survivor, I wouldn't have worn that dress. I wouldn't have had those extra drinks. I wouldn't have been out at 1 a.m. Here's all the things that I have control over that I wouldn't do. And therefore, I would not be in that same position. So it's our brain. It's really a response that we have that tries to protect us from believing or understanding that this could happen to us. So taking yourself out of that cycle, out of that loop where it really is pretty victim blaming and saying, all right, I'm going to start by believing until the facts that come out prove beyond a reasonable doubt otherwise, I'm going to start by believing that survivor. Because we know false reports for this kind of crime are no higher than any other person's faced crime, yet they get the most attention.
It could happen to anyone, like you said. And I'm even sitting here thinking, Kimberly, while you're sharing all of this, about how many times I've walked in the dark at night somewhere and could have happened then. We all are one step away from this happening. And it's sad to say that in this world, but it's true. We all can make all the decisions in the world to protect ourselves, but sometimes that's not even enough. Here you are sleeping in your apartment where you should be safe. And that is so often when a lot of these assaults happen too, where somebody is in a place that they're safe or comfortable, or they're at somebody's house that they trust and they think that they're in a okay situation. And that's where it happens. So I just encourage everybody who's listening to this story right now to open your eyes and pay attention and look back at your own life and think about the times when it could have been you, or it could have been your friend, or it could have been it could have been anyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this isn't to instill fear. I'm not trying to scare you when I say it could be you. I'm trying to impart empathy. I'm trying to say, don't be so quick to judge. Be quick to believe and understand that you can hold space and you can direct to resources and you can find proper professionals to help your friend or loved one who is choosing to disclose to you. It's not to live in fear, but to live with empathy.
What are some of the things that brought you healing? I know that healing from anything in life is a lifelong journey to find healing, but what are some things that helped you?
I would say wine, sarcasm, and at the time I watched a lot of Scrubs. No, I mean, I've throughout my time as a survivor and a victim, because it goes back and forth. I use those fluidly because there are days that I still feel like a victim. Most days as a survivor, but they can go back and forth, and it's however you are choosing to identify yourself that day. Therapy was huge for me because I had access. Just so everyone knows that if you report to law enforcement, you have the ability to access victims' compensation in some form in every single state in the United States. For Colorado, my victim advocate helped us and my parents and my boyfriend and my roommates at the time all fill out paperwork so that we would have access to counseling if we so choose. I did get started right away. It didn't help a lot at first. What really helped during that first time period was the support of my friends and my family, and the fact that we were going through the court system, that the prosecutors and the team there took the extra time to answer questions every single time that we would go in for court, you had 65 sorority women standing with me in heels that were, 2 to 3 inches stilettos that would make this really loud clacking sound as we walked down the hallways of this government building. And every single time we had to go to court, I was supported. I was surrounded by people who cared. That made the biggest difference to me. It put me on a path to healing quicker. Now, that isn't to say that if you don't have that kind of support that you won't heal. I think that it just expedited my own healing. So therapy was a game changer when I started having panic attacks that led to PTSD and depression, which eventually led to something called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures related to PTSD. This is a condition that is commonly misdiagnosed as epilepsy or as a mental disorder. But it's basically your brain's reaction to intense stress and trauma shutting down, and it manifests looking like a seizure. So I started having these, which called into question whether or not I would even be able to testify. I switched the types of therapy that I was doing. I started seeing a new therapist. We did EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Highly recommend it. That's a whole other soapbox that I could stand on and scream from the rooftops, because I think it is an amazing approach to therapy for people like me that want to sit there and be like, I'm fine. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm fine. Or can't find the words for the things that they are experiencing or feeling. So I love EMDR. It helped immensely. And then, of course, I made the mistake, which I talk about on our podcast. I made the mistake of hanging my hat for healing on the justice system outcome. Don't do that. I got very lucky because he was put away. But most of the time, the justice system isn't going to work that way. And even then, even with the quote slam dunk case with DNA and everything else that we had, we still didn't know what the outcome would be. That jury might have found reason to say, I don't know. I can't believe it. And I don't trust DNA or whatever it might be. You never know the outcome of a trial. So base your healing on the things that you have control over, the things that you can actively participate in, seek out, do to heal yourself. So beyond just those, very canned responses, dark humor is like a huge part of my life. I've always kind of thought, you got to laugh to keep from crying. And that was just exacerbated in a massive way when you add trauma on top of it. But I mean, it's always just been the support of other people, of finding value and confidence in my voice, even when it has wavered. It's not just like I got that verdict, I released my name, and I rode off into the sunset. That is not the only trauma that I have suffered in my life. And I mean capital T trauma. But it did lay a foundation for me to know that these are the things that worked for me in therapy. These are my healthy coping mechanisms. These are my unhealthy ones, and how to address those and ask for help sooner rather than later before I go down a rabbit hole. When I talk to college kids, it's, hey, the trauma responses that I had that maybe your peers are having blend in seamlessly with the college experience. Binge drinking, promiscuity. Sometimes it is self-harm in different ways. Compulsion. All of these different things blend in with how I'm figuring out who I am between the ages of 20 and 20, or 18 and 22. But they can also be indicative of something bigger that's going on. How do you have those conversations? How do you talk to your friends when you see that this is going on from a place of love and support, but also accountability? And so I love workshopping those and having those conversations, because they're not easy and they're not instilled in us. We don't come right out of the womb knowing how to have these talks. And a lot of adults still struggle with it too.
Yeah, it's so important to talk about. I was having a conversation with a friend over the past week just about red flags and how so often people see things that are unraveling in our life and they just don't say something, even our friends. And so I think for everyone who's listening, recognize those. And it does take courage also to say to somebody like, hey, are you okay? Or I've noticed this is going on. None of us are perfect, right? So sometimes that can be taken as like, oh, look at you, you're all perfect and coming over and telling me what to do. But we need to speak up for our friends and stand with our friends when they share something like what you're talking about, how people did that for you. What would you say to people that are listening if someone shares in confidence or shares something that happened? What can we do to support people in those situations?
One of the biggest things, if someone decides to disclose to you, is that what they are sharing is not your story to tell. They are confiding in you, and that is where it stays. And from there, that is the ownership over something so traumatic like that needs to remain with that victim, with that person who is telling you. Because the minute that you decide, oh, I can tell this person, they're fine, it will end up getting out. Now, it isn't just like, what Kara, my co-host, and I have talked about is it isn't just major news networks that pick up our stories and run them and get different things wrong, or podcasts or social media or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be that big. For most people, it's going to be a friend shared with a friend, and they didn't tell them friend that themselves. That spotlight effect can feel the same way in that instance as it would with CNN running incorrect information about my story. It feels the same to the survivor because it is that re-victimization, and as if everyone in their world, everyone in their bubble now knows something that they weren't ready to talk about. So maintain and grant that ownership to stay with the survivor. Identifying your resources ahead of time. No one thinks to look these things up. I sure as heck didn't. So know where your resources are locally. You want to have, a 24-hour chat option just in case. Some people find it really helpful, and you don't just have to be in crisis right afterwards to access that. It can be mental health as well. So knowing where those resources are, have them just saved in a note on your phone. It can be in the back of your mind, or being able to at least know how to Google and what to look up if you find yourself in that scenario. Another great thing to point out is that I believe legislation has caught up because of VAWA. Don't quote me. You can access we call them SANE examinations, but sexual assault nurse examiners, rape kits are what they're commonly referred to. You can access one of those and have that done at a hospital and not pay for it. Number one, it'll be billed to the jurisdiction in which it happened. And also, you don't have to report. You can have a SANE examination done. You can do that, quote, rape kit and not report to police, but they will save that evidence if you so choose to do so at another time. And beyond that, it's good to have, that record for yourself and to be able to say, okay, I know that I'm healthy. You can get tested. I think that's a big one that I actually forget often to talk about when I do speeches and such. I had to wait 8 months for the results of the HIV testing to come back. I had no idea. Could this stranger who broke in be HIV positive? I do not know, but I had to wait for that long amount of time to figure it out. So there's a lot of different things that nurses who are specifically trained in this type of evidence collection and patient care can do to make you feel more at ease, but keeping that control, again, with the survivor. And then, of course, believing them. Hold space. You don't have to ask questions. It's not your job to be judge, jury, executioner. It's to be a shoulder. It's to be a warm embrace if that's what they need. It's to be that point of comfort and stability for them in a time where it feels like everything else is unraveling and falling apart. It's that simple, and yet to a victim means the world.
Just holding space and being a good support system and a friend, and just there if they at 2 a.m. need to call and just cry to somebody on the other side of the phone, or tell a story or tell something that they remembered. We have so much power just holding space, like you said, for people. So, oh my gosh, Kimberly, you've done so much, even since college. So all this happens, you get out of college, you start working in law enforcement, and now you're speaking, doing regular media appearances, you're on social media, you have this podcast. Talk to me about the work you're doing now and why it's so important.
Sure. I started as a victim advocate, just volunteer on call with the police department that investigated and arrested my offender, which was a really cool full circle moment. And then as I went on to finish my bachelor's and study for criminal justice master's, I started at the Weld County District Attorney's Office, where I created and ran a pre-plea negotiation low-level offender program that is still in effect today called Adult Diversion. Loved that work, but it gave me that experience of working with victims outside of what I had just gone through. And crime victimization as a whole is something that is still woefully misunderstood. I'm lucky enough to live in a state that is typically on the forefront of victim rights and the amendments that we choose to make in favor of victims, but those are still not guaranteed, constantly under attack. And you have offenders and their families who are constantly going to be advocating for themselves because they have nothing else to do. So I've got involved in the legislative process, especially on a state level, fairly often, in which I have to retell the very worst thing that's ever happened to me just for the credibility to speak against whatever bill is being proposed that would pigeonhole or not help survivors who are in the same space as me. I've loved doing that work. I also understand that sometimes I'm not the right person that should be speaking out. I want to make sure that these voices that are represented are diverse, that they aren't all from the same background, and I lend my voice when I can. When I talk about media, I love the production media side of all of the things. And I really think it goes back to my cringy videos where I'm pretending to be on the Titanic or doing magic shows or narrating. I made fake NPR commercials with Beanie Babies asking for callers to donate $5. Like, let's just hope that those stay buried in my parents' basement and never see the light of YouTube. But I have always loved and had a heart for how stories are told in the media. In that same vein, I also have a massive understanding of the fact that there is this, I hate to even say it out loud because you and I talked about this before we started recording, but there is this stereotype where if it bleeds, it leads. And those are the stories that people want to see in the news, and those are the ones they consume, and those are the ones they doom scroll on. And I want to change that. When Kara and I first met and started talking, we had both had our stories used in ways that we didn't consent to. And so this idea of media-based consent coverage for survivors, trauma-informed, survivor-centric coverage has always been in our minds, and pulling that into fruition, we didn't know what it was going to sound like or look like. At first, we're trying to do TikTok lives together, and it's like, it doesn't work yet, and we can't do that. And so we went through quite a few iterations of what we wanted this revolutionary, it ended up being a podcast, but movement, if you will, to look like. And it was inviting people into our space to take that microphone, to tell their story the way that they want to, with the calls to action, with the resources, and with all of the confidence in the world that they walk out of there and they still own that. They are actively involved in the process. Nothing gets shared that they wouldn't do themselves. And they are an active participant every single step of the way. And so it took the shape of Survivor's Guide to True Crime. We're never going to get away from that true crime genre because, hey, we're crime victims. But the way that we commonly see true crime consumed is a layout of the crime scene and the background of the offender, and here's the bloody knife. And it is sensationalized in a way that makes you forget the people at the center of what has happened, the survivors. We aren't interested in the crime itself. We're interested in the ripple effect, in all of the things that happened after the fact. How did you find your voice? What did you do to change? What are some trauma responses that you had that you didn't understand? What are some things that you feel like you didn't do, quote, right? What are all the things that made you get back up and move from victim to survivor and find the voice that you have now? Because that's where people are going to learn. That's where true crime often misses the mark, because the people listening want to feel like we have control, like it won't happen to us. They want to understand why this happens. But the most important part to understand is what we can do afterwards. How can we support these people? How can we hold others accountable for their actions, and how can we work to build each other and ourselves back up in spite of what happened to us.
It's so good. A Survivor's Guide to True Crime. I will be sure to link it in all of our show notes, along with all the other things that we've shared in this. But it's so powerful. Like you said, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's what we're seeing so often in the media. I love crime shows, but I also recognize that. I see that it's always this like, it's from a specific perspective and it's edited in a certain way to make it more salacious or interesting, whatever, however that the media works. And we see that also in our mainstream media where everything is politicized and divisive, especially when it comes to women. And so I love that you and Kara have created this space for women to tell their stories. And you've had amazing people. You both individually have shared your stories on the podcast, but also Elizabeth Smart, JC Duggard, Amanda Knox, and others. So many others have been on the podcast. So I want to encourage everybody to listen and subscribe to your podcast and continue to support what you're doing. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. And we're having a lot of fun. It's nice when your passion meets something that you also really enjoy doing. And we get to have conversations with badass survivors, like what's not to love. So we are really enjoying doing this and putting it out into the world, and are thankful for the responses that we've received, and just no end in sight.
If you like what you're hearing on this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. We have new inspiring episodes coming out every week, and you don't want to miss a single one. Subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast today. So you have the podcast. I know you're speaking. So people that are listening, they can invite you to come speak on their campus. And you also are doing a lot of work with In Violence Against Women International and the Start by Believing campaign. Talk to me about the things that you're working on and what is to come. What does the future hold for you, Kimberly? I know you're working on a lot of things.
Yes. Well, this is I pick a word for every year and I try to stick to it. And 2023's word was fruition, because I have worked for so long, so hard behind the scenes in quiet. And this is the year that all of these things are finally culminating and paying off. And I would say stay tuned for a lot of these. You'll probably be first to hear it on social media, on Survivor's Guide to True Crime. But we are honestly working to change the way that the true crime world works and the way that survivors are represented. Changing big legislation and laws has always been in the forefront of my mind, and I'm happy to lend my voice when those places and those things align. And then, I think that the change in advocacy, at least in the terms of social media, is reaching an audience that it would not have otherwise reached. And I have loved putting out content that is educational, but also uses, my sense of humor and the ability to connect with people that are from different backgrounds. So I feel like that's kind of my runaround answer for what's to come. I love speaking, though. That's always been my bread and butter, and the one thing that keeps me grounded and provides me with, I call them breadcrumbs, to let me know that I am still on the right path. Every once in a while, I'll get a message or someone that will come up to me and tell me how they've been impacted, how they regained their voice. I'm never the one that did that. If I simply reminded you that you already had the strength within you, great. But you are the one that's doing that work. You are the one that is taking control of what your healing and your journey and building back the even better person than you were before looks like. I'm here to simply remind you. So speaking has always been near and dear to my heart. I have all of the things on my website if you're looking to book. It's not just campuses. I love doing college campuses, but I also train for organizations, law enforcement, hospitals for the nurses. I've spoken to quite a few different places, but the work that I do in media is meant to reach as many people as need it. And I just hope that message continues to be told and retold and makes you really look inward for the survivors in your life, because you are a part of that ripple effect and can make a difference.
Kimberly, is there a story of somebody, one of those breadcrumbs, somebody that shared their story with you? And I want to be respectful of the fact that we don't want to tell other people's stories. But was there an experience where maybe you were having a rough day and you were like, why am I doing this? I know it can be really difficult sometimes talking about sexual assault and the topics that you're talking about, and, still dealing with your own experience and your own trauma and sharing that with other people. But is there a story of maybe somebody, however you feel comfortable sharing, that kind of lit that fire again behind you, or was like, yeah, that's a light bulb moment. I need to keep going. I need to keep doing this.
Oh gosh, yeah. I would say they happen almost every time that I speak. I've never given a speech and not had someone come up to me afterwards and disclose. My DMs are constantly flooded with people that are telling their stories, it can be hard to consume. I really have to be intentional about the boundaries that I have. I know that I can't respond to every single one of these, and doing that one-on-one victim advocacy really causes a lot of burnout. So I have to be really intentional with the times that I do take those on. But being able to see the work, in quotes, pay off. There's one that always sticks out to me. It was a conference that I had done, and I will keep this very general to protect her privacy. But I had spoke at this conference a year prior, and then the next year went back and gave sort of a different take on that keynote. And I had quite a few young college-age women that were lined up afterwards to talk to me. And this girl approaches, and I can tell she's having a bit of an emotional reaction. So I kind of took her aside so she didn't have to be out in public as much. And she said, I just wanted to thank you for speaking. I was here last year. And because of your talk, I knew when I went back to school in the fall, as I was being sexually assaulted, I knew that that's what it was while it was happening, and was able to think about it and gather evidence and report. And she went to trial. She reported and went to trial and held that offender accountable. And again, I didn't do that. I simply gave her the tools to regain her strength. I reminded her that she already has that bravery and that strength within her. I'm simply here as a reminder. And I don't care if you remember my name or my face. I want you to remember this story. And I want you to remember how you feel when you hear a story like this. And hopefully that fire is lit under you too, because every single one of us can make a difference. My story, my voice, no more important than anyone else's. I just happen to have a microphone right now. Every single person has the ability to make this level of impact and more. And we have to support each other when we come forward and do this.
And it starts in our own lives, our own communities, that we can be a voice. We can also be a support system for people. And so I encourage everybody to start with your family, your friends, your own community. You don't have to have a stage or a microphone or be on a podcast to make an impact. Exactly what you're saying, Kimberly.
Exactly.
Kimberly, if you could get to the very root of why you do what you do every single day, and it might be those survivor stories, it might be your own story, it might be your children, it might be what you're fighting for in the criminal justice system. What is the root of what drives you to do what you do every single day?
All of those things that you just named, absolutely. I want to make a difference. When I was sexually assaulted, my face was covered for most of the time. And there were a few times that he moved this black shirt covering my face just enough that I was able to see out a 2-inch gap in my blinds. On the outside is this beautiful spring morning with a path and the back of the garages and plants. And I kept looking out that little gap in my blinds, hoping and praying that anyone would walk by and save me. And today, my driving force is to be the person on the other side of that window. I have learned that I can be the one that saves myself and every single other person. If you are listening to this, you can too.
Everyone has the ability to be that. That's amazing. Kimberly, what can people do to support your work, and what can we do to emulate your work? I know you've given some ways that we can all support survivors, but what can people do to support you and the work that you're doing? And what can they do to emulate the work that you're doing?
Sure. You can find me on my website. It's kimberlycorban.com, Corban. I think the biggest call to action is to subscribe, rate, review, listen to our podcast, tell a friend. It's Survivor's Guide to True Crime. Kara and I both have it linked, and I know Kara's been on here before as well. So, listen to those episodes, have some crucial conversations about them, keep an open mind, because I don't want you to agree with us 100% of the time. I want you to use your own life experiences, your own choices, your own trauma or reactions in your life to draw conclusions from an open-minded point of view. And I think that's really what we try to do on each of these. We call them chapters as opposed to episodes. But for each chapter, we are introducing you to someone and how they overcame what they did. What are the things in your life that you are able to do? So I really put it back on everyone that's listening, viewing, attending, whatever it might be. What are the things that you can do in your life right now to make changes? So I love the support there. If you or an organization that you work with would like to have me come speak, it is my very favorite thing to do. You can do those booking requests through KimberlyCorban.com. Follow me on social media. I am kind of a goofball there, and you'll get a really eclectic look at my life. And it's everything from survivors to foster puppies to my husband and I being absolute nerds. He and I do a presentation jointly as well, and actually just trained as the closing plenary session at EVA last week in Chicago. But yeah, you'll get a little bit of everything there. And I would say, if you are looking to get started on what you can do in your own life to help survivors, start by going to startbybelieving.org. And I will have the links on my website easily as well. But take the pledge, completely free. You'll have access to plenty of information. You can start a Start by Believing campaign in your own community. And it's completely free. All of those resources are right there. If you'd like to have me or someone from EVA come in, give a testimonial like this, get people fired up and excited to do that, we are happy to do so. But all of those resources and abilities to create this in your own community and in your own life are right there online at startbybelieving.org.
And I will put all of those websites in the show notes, all of your social media, so people can easily follow you and everything that you're doing. Kimberly, you are a one girl revolution. You are truly a force to be reckoned with. And I'm so grateful to spend this time with you. But who's a one girl revolution in your life? Who's a woman or girl that inspires you?
So I knew this question was coming, and I've had how long to think about it?
A little while, but it's hard. It's hard to pick one, especially with the work that you're doing.
So this is going to sound kind of silly. It's probably now my daughter, and she is a whopping 8 years old, but she is a constant lesson in love, compassion, consent, and giving tiny humans the tools and the grace and the ability to grow up and become whoever they're supposed to be, and whoever they're supposed to be being their choice. So I would say that's probably who it is. I'll leave you with a little story, but my assault occurred on May 12th in 2006. It was also my mom's birthday. My mom would also be one of my one girls. And it was this day that was so complex because I have to remember what happened to me and how far I've come, but also we still want to make it a celebration. When I was celebrating the 10th and even 15th anniversary of this crime, I did a tweet series where I went minute by minute as to what had happened the day of, so that people got a glimpse into what survivors experience in just one day of being a victim. And so I went through that exercise and then recrafted it and recorded it for social media for the 15th anniversary. And as I was leading up to this, it was in the couple weeks beforehand, my daughter comes in and she's like, "What are you doing, mommy?" Like, well, I'm going through and I'm making all of the videos about the day that the day that the bad man broke into mommy's apartment. And she's kind of sitting there thinking about it for a little bit. And she's like, "Oh, so this is for your brave day." I was like, "What? The day that you were brave. It's your brave day." And so I was like, oh, like rush of chills, everything out of the mouth of a 6-year-old. And I was like, yeah, It's my Brave Day. My Brave Day is coming up again on May 12th. And now it is a celebration of how far we've come, not just me, not just my family, but as a society and how we talk about victimization and the role that we play in moving victims to survivors. So I would invite you to celebrate your own Brave Days. And if you don't have one, you're welcome to borrow mine on May 12th. But I've loved that different shift in outlook. And it's just a common thing that now we talk about, and to be able to reference a brave day instead of something traumatic that happened to you just changes your outlook, changes your perspective, and can change the world.
I love that so much. Brave Day. I was getting choked up as you were telling that story, but what a beautiful, sweet girl. And we can learn so much even from children, right? Out of the mouths of babes, how they can see things from a different perspective. But I'm going to be celebrating with you, Kimberly, on May 12th. And I know that all of our listeners will as well. And I encourage, like you said, I encourage everyone to find that Brave Day. I'm going to be thinking about that because I want to have a Brave Day too and celebrate.
I promise you, I will do something with that. I have not fully vetted out what it looks like, but it's definitely going to be, in your words, revolutionary.
Yeah. Well, you are revolutionary. So is your daughter. And so are all of the women in this world that have stepped up and survived. I think that, whether you've shared your story or not, you are a survivor of so many things in life. And we all have the power to change the world through our lives. And that's what we believe here at One Girl Revolution. And Kimberly, you are that, and you are changing the world every single day. But before I let you go, I always end on this question. So I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
This is something that my forensic nurse examiner told me the morning of my assault, as I sat in a closed off emergency room with not my own clothes, feeling not in my own body. And I went through this process of having my crime scene of a body picked apart and handed over. And she took my hand from the side of the bed and looked me in the eyes. And she said, "You are braver and stronger than you know." And I have carried that with me ever since. And I would offer you the exact same words. You are braver and stronger than you know.
Kimberly, you are so brave and so strong. And I know you've inspired so many people through this hour and through all the work that you're doing every single day. Thank you so much for being on the One Girl Revolution podcast. And thank you for all the incredible work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number One Girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com.